Okay, guys, Asun Dutoya, and I hope you guys have been watching all the videos. And recently, or not recently, last year, I did a video about whether you should put a property into a trust, and that video just went absolutely viral. Some people saying you should, some people saying you shouldn't. And I thought, you know what, the best way to answer this question is to speak to an expert. So today I'm sitting here with Bruno, and Bruno is a business, property, and tax attorney, specializing very much so with structures like trusts and property companies. So I'm going to be quizzing him and asking him certain questions, around this, so that we can once and for all get to a point where we say, should we be putting property into a trust, or should we not be doing it at all? So Bruno, welcome firstly. Thanks for coming. And I think maybe let's just start with a little bit about your background. Maybe explain to us what it is you do, what you specialize in. If you can just do that for us.
Perfect, thanks so much. So I've been in the property space for about 20 years now, in the legal, property, commercial, and business space. My primary focus has always been in deal making. So I'm that attorney that you contact when you need to close a deal and you need to find the gaps where the seller and the purchasers aren't meeting each other. My team obviously does the conveyancing and the litigation and all that sort of jazz, but my focus is making sure that the deals are closed. I started out in litigation, so there's always problem-solving mode. Every problem has a solution, just depends on how you approach it. And that's always been my motto, and now I've got totally dedicated litigation departments, and I'm only focusing on tax structuring, business structuring, and those type of conversations.
Okay, great stuff. Okay, let's speak about the property. Let's speak specifically about this concept of putting a property into a trust. Now, you and I had a conversation not too long ago where when I asked you this question, you said, it really does depend. You mentioned something, and I don't want to take your thunder away. I'm going to leave a lot of the details to you. But you mentioned, for example, should a person actually be using a trust at all? And you mentioned certain thresholds, which I'm not going to mention. I'll leave that to you. That maybe they shouldn't even be using a trust unless they have a certain size of asset base. And then once that asset base starts growing, what is the best structure? And then again, some people are investors in property, and maybe a certain structure will be suitable to them. And others, they're buying one property, they're going to live in this property, they're not buying another property. Should they be putting that into a trust? So maybe let's separate the two as we speak about this. Maybe let's start with, let's say we're speaking about the person that's buying a property to own it. It's going to be a family home. They're not a property investor per se. That's the intention. Should that person be putting their property into a trust, and if so, under what circumstances?
So we always need to have the conversation with that person as an example as to what his estate planning is. So the estate planning is a very important thing. If we just look at one asset, one property, they're buying it, they want to live on that property, we need to remember that in South Africa at the moment as it stands, with the residential property that you reside in, but it's your primary residence, you do get that 2 million rand exclusion from a capital gains tax. Right. So if you think about it from the perspective of, I own a property, I'm going to live in it, and maybe I'm going to sell this property in 20 years and move somewhere else and buy another property and live in that property, then you wouldn't actually really need it in a trust if you're not going to keep it anyway. Because if you're going to dispose of it, it means that at some point or another you're going to really have to pay these taxes. So that 2 million rand exclusion really helps with primary residences. Right. So if it's your home, I would say, buy it in your personal name. This is not for everyone. So it's not legal advice to say everyone do this, because if it's your home, but in 20 years time you go, I'm going to buy another one, but I'll keep this and maybe I'm going to rent it out. Now it's becoming a business. So now you're not selling it. Now you pass away and now you want your kids to have it. Very different conversation there, because now you've used it partly as a business, partly as a primary residence, so you don't get the full 2 million rand exclusion. So it depends on everyone, but yes, to answer your question, if you have to kind of spitball an answer, there's really nice benefits for a primary residence owner to buy his personal name.
Okay, there's a good tax benefit there. And I think, I didn't say this at the beginning, but I'm just going to put a disclaimer. This is not financial advice, this is education. You would always want to be sitting with your attorney or a financial advisor that's skilled enough to advise you on your personal circumstances.
No,
Right? So let's just make sure we get that out of the way. Okay, so we've spoken about the whole primary residence scenario. So let's now speak about the business scenario, the person that has a business or properties, and they want to know, should I be building, and I'm very much in the property space, and in my time as a banker, I never ever, maybe let me not say never ever, but very rarely did I see a big property player putting all his properties into a trust. It was always under a certain structure, and just for the sake of this conversation, it was always trust at the top, possibly a holding company at the bottom that's 100% owned by the trust, and then normally another company at the bottom, which is normally a property, a holding company where all the assets are lying, right? And that could be business or property. So I think maybe speak to us about that scenario where the person is a business person or a property investor. At what point should they be considering putting a trust in place? If they're going to use a trust, how should it be used? You know, what's the most tax efficient and best way to make use of that?
So I think to answer that question, what really helps is to understand the origin, because a lot of people watching this video have maybe gotten different advice from different places. There's players out there that approach this in a very different way. There's people out there with years of experience, 30, 40 years of experience in their own estate planning that will give you certain piece of advice. First thing you need to remember is your origin matters. Now, a couple of years ago, many years ago, trusts weren't taxed as badly as they're being taxed now. So a trust nowadays is taxed at 45%, right? In the past, it was never like that. So it was a really good idea to have a trust and even receive income into a trust because it was taxed a lot less than that, right? So what does this mean? This means that a trust is an income earner is taxed very, very high. So having any asset that generates income in that trust means that you're going to pay very high tax, right? Okay. Now, small little disclaimer there or qualification. What you intend to do with the money matters. So if you intend to build an empire within a trust and the trust is earning this income, you're going to pay 45% tax. Not a good idea, right? If you're planning to use this money, right, remember our law does still provide for that old school rule of the trust can own the asset, but the beneficiaries will receive the distributions and will pay tax in their personal names. So yes, there is some benefit, but like you said, these big income earners, they're not going to do that because how many beneficiaries do you have with low tax rates? Right. We've actually got clients now that started receiving so much money through that trust that their kids had to register as taxpayers, and eventually got to the point where the kids were paying large amounts of tax where it just didn't make sense anymore. They were paying more than a company would, so it really didn't make sense to distribute to them anymore. So remember, trust has its place when it comes to earning the income, but it's more an exception than it is the rule. And going to what you said, that's why the players in the market now are going, well, 45% versus 27% that you pay in a company. Why would I want to pay 45 if I can pay 27, right? So with the trust as a benefit, because obviously then people go, then why have a trust? I mean, then it doesn't make sense. Who needs a trust? Just run your business in the company. So the one thing I have to say, remember that a trust is separate from you as an individual. So let's move away from tax. Asset protection. There is nothing in South Africa like a trust. Nothing compares to it. Because a trust is separate from you, right? If you draft the trust properly, you as a beneficiary don't have any vested rights in that trust. Meaning that if you go bankrupt, no one can go after the trust. But if you, as a shareholder, get into financial trouble, they can go after your shares in that company. So that's the one benefit. So why have a trust at all? It's not for tax. It's for asset protection. And that's real estate planning. Trust doesn't die. So now you pass away, they scratch your name off the letter of authority of the trust, they write somebody new, and your kids just keep benefiting. And they pass away and their kids keep benefiting. That's true intergenerational wealth. You don't have to move asset after asset to beneficiary and expect them to actually stay in this asset. Because you don't know who's going to get it.
Okay. Yeah. Okay, so essentially what you're saying, if we can summarize this, for understanding, we're basically saying that For asset protection, you use the trust, not necessarily because I'm just trying to answer this in a way. Are we saying that we should put it into a company and then let the trust own the shares? Ideally, that's ideally the structure we want, versus actually putting those assets into the trust. Speaking to the origin point as well.
Yes, exactly. The high tax rate doesn't make sense to do it. Rather hold shares in the company. Trust doesn't actually earn any income. Company earns the income.
Okay, so the trust holding the asset as an income generator is only beneficial if those beneficiaries are going to stay low income earners.
Yes.
But as long as that trust keeps on building income, distributing to beneficiaries, they start getting to the higher tax bracket, which is where the company
and
makes
remember,
more
they
sense.
get jobs as well. So if you look at it from a kid perspective, one day they're going to be a high income earner in their own name.
Yes.
What are you going to do with those distributions from the trust?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Okay. So there you have it, right? So the ideal situation is not to have it in a trust, have it in a company, and it all comes down to your intention of what you're going to be doing, how big do you plan on building that portfolio. Growth is important. And let's speak about, before we end off, I want to speak about when should you have a trust at all? Because some people probably, I see people, they've never owned a property ever. And they send me a message on social media, and I want to register a trust and I want to put my property into my trust. Is that a good idea? When should you really have a trust?
Look, so if we have a conversation around asset protection and say that the main benefit of the trust is asset protection, we have to ask ourselves, number one, how risky is our lives? If you're a salary earner and that's all you're ever going to be, then your life isn't very risky. So asset protection wise, please don't overly stress. If your asset value isn't that high, then what are you protecting yourself from? Because remember, if you pass away and you need to move your assets to your family members, there's certain costs involved, right? But you don't pay estate duty, for example, on anything under 3.5 million rand.
Right.
So you're not saving anything. If you've got an estate under 3.5 million rand, you're not saving anything by having it in a trust.
Right.
Because you're not going to pay tax anyway at that 20% estate duty. So there is still that notion of high asset, like a high asset base should fall within this trust model. So you're looking at high-end guys with a lot of assets.
Right.
Problem with properties versus just general business people. If I start a tech company today, it's not worth anything.
Right.
It's not worth it. So I can actually build up this company up to whatever, a certain amount of money before I put it into a trust. So I have time to contemplate.
Right.
So the story of me having nothing, having a trust, and now hoping to put stuff in, that's premature. Problem with properties is there you need to make a decision on mindset. Right? Are you a property investor? Yes. Are you going to be a property investor? Yes. Are you planning on getting a good, decent amount of properties? Let's say at least 5 million rand, 6 million rand worth. Yes. Well, then start now, even on zero, because changing it later is a bit of it's a nightmare. So that's the only time I would say intention matters. Yes, everyone intends to grow their tech company into multi-billion rand company, but you've got time to see if it's going to happen. With property, not always so much. So there I would say, be careful. If you want to do it properly, start from day one, but as long as your mindset is right.
Okay. So a lot of what Bruno is saying here is intention matters. What you're deciding to do. So the guy that's starting a business and it might be worth something, you might not need to open that trust right now, but maybe down the line you look at your portfolio and you're like, wow, my company is now worth 20 million rand. I might need to consider registering a trust for certain asset protection advantages. And I just want to clarify that Bruno is not necessarily saying that once it grows to a certain size that now you're going to put the assets into a trust. What he's saying is then maybe a trust in your overall structure becomes important to add in.
Yes.
But you might find that all these assets are still owned by those companies below the trust. Okay. So guys, I hope you enjoyed this video. I don't think this is the last video I'm going to be doing with you, Bruno. You and I spoke before this and I can already see a few things we need to speak about. But I hope you guys enjoyed this. Drop your comments, drop your questions. And if you need to reach out to Bruno, how do they get hold of you?
Look, comment on this video, and I'm sure you'll let me know. Otherwise, I can insert the email address, general email address for.
I'll put that below. So I'll put that below the video. I'll just, if you guys want to get hold of him. But Bruno, thanks a lot for making time, and chat soon.